So at this time, I would like to welcome Eric Berger. He'll be our first presenter. Eric, good morning.
Hi, Sherry. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. My name is Eric Berger. I'm also here with Bob Eatman. We both are of the finance team from the Resource Center of the Federal Highway Administration. And between Bob and I, over the next couple of days, hopefully we will enlighten the group on various components of developing and reviewing indirect cost allocation plans. That's what we're here for today. The workshop is intended for state employees and FHWA employees as well. We do have some division staff from the California division. Want to welcome everybody from the division staff, also from Caltrans. There's also a few local public agency participants. Welcome to all of those as well. This will be an online workshop, about 2.5 hours for the next 4 days. We'll be taking a break, probably somewhere in the middle. This is going to be a pretty fast-paced delivery of this material. Bob and I have taught this class for many years. Most of the time it's been on site with much larger groups. So we did a conversion over into this Zoom and online delivery method. So it'll be a little bit different than what we've done in the past, but Bob and I have delivered this many times. So we're looking for a really good class. Any questions that you may have are all important. And because of the pace of the class, you're going to have to jump in and stop us if you'd like to have a discussion about a specific topic or you need some clarification. As Sherry said, go ahead and raise your hand or jump in or anything like that. Sherry, are you able to see my share screen? I'm not getting the blue pattern.
Yes, we can see your slides.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, great. Just a little bit of background too on the development of this course right here. So Rodney Whitfield, he's the director of the finance services at the FHWA Division Office of California, reached out to Bob and I requesting this workshop. Rodney and his team had done some surveys out to see, what type of topics would be of importance for indirect cost allocation. And so we use those surveys and kind of customize this training to focus on a larger portion of it, to focus on reviewing indirect cost allocation plans, because we know there at Caltrans in the audit group, you all are responsible for looking at indirect cost plans from various local public agencies, NPOs, and so on and so forth. So that's really the tailoring that we did. And we did include a lot of those survey topics of interest in this class. So we're glad everybody's here. Our goal is, for you to understand, what makes up an indirect cost allocation plan, all the bells and whistles, and what to look for as you go through reviewing those. And I'll be scanning the chat pod. Bob will be scanning it as well as we go along. So let's take a look at our next 4 days, the agenda. So these agenda slides that you see here, and you also should have them in your participant workbook, which I'll talk about here in just a minute, but these are basically also the learning outcomes. So as we go through these, just keep these in mind, and we can bounce back to them each day as we move forward. So we will do some introductions today. It's going to be a chat pod introduction. So we'll ask you to put some information in the chat pod just to recognize who you are, where you're from, and so on. We'll do that here in a few minutes. But today we start off with some very important foundational background information that we need to have going into the indirect cost allocation plan. So we'll be talking a little bit about regulations, where to find those. We talk about understanding the stewardship and oversight requirements as they relate to indirect cost. And all of this is extremely important because it's the high level umbrella that gives us that foundation for that. this is big here. Find the available resources. We spend a lot of time in this class we'll bounce out to various regulations. And the idea there is, to ensure that you know where to find the information. And this is one of my favorite quotes from a Chinese philosopher, Lao Tzu. Give a man a fish and you'll feed him for a day, but if you teach a man to fish, you'll feed him for the rest of his life. And this is kind of the approach Bob and I take on all of our classes is that not only do we put the main topics out there and discuss them in bullet format in these typical PowerPoint presentations, but we also want you to be able to know where to find that information, the source of that information, because that will help you throughout your career or your job or your task that you're involved in by knowing where to find that information. Today, we're going to talk about the factors that impact claiming indirect costs. There's some advantages to claiming indirect costs, and there's some disadvantages, when an organization needs to claim their overhead costs. So we'll talk a little bit about those. We'll walk through the differences of indirect costs and direct costs. And this is important because as they develop their indirect cost plan or proposal, they have what we call cost pools, and we'll go into those. But understanding what type of cost is what, you've got to be able to separate those. That's usually the first step in either developing an indirect cost, or if you're reviewing an indirect cost plan, you've got to be able to recognize that organization effectively separated their direct costs from their indirect costs. So we'll get a lot into that. We want to understand the classifications of costs, the various pools that are out there. We also want to talk about the allowability of costs, how we can determine cost allowability, because when we're talking about federal dollars, allowability is a very key component, not only to charging direct cost to projects, but also indirect costs as well. And so we'll spend some time in the cost principles, which is subpart E of 2 CFR 200, and really get down into the basic considerations. And then tomorrow we'll finish up with the cost principles into the selected items of cost. Day one is a pretty heavy day. I think we got 36 slides to run through today. Tomorrow is equally heavy on content. And then day 3 and 4, we kind of slow down a little bit and start putting the puzzle together. So let's take a look at day 2. Day 2, we want to continue with those cost principles, specifically those selected items of cost. Bob will take the reins, I think, starting tomorrow morning and do the remainder of those cost principles. And then he'll also get into centralized services. And that's a big piece of indirect costs. Centralized services are those services that are provided either from a higher agency or from somewhere else. For instance, the state of California provides services from the state level to the various departments, including the Caltrans and the Department of Transportation. And so because those are indirect costs, but they're being provided from somewhere else, a higher entity, most of the time, they still are allowable and can be claimed in indirect cost allocation plans. So we want to really figure out what do we do with those centralized services and how are they reflected in the indirect cost allocation plan or proposal. And then we want to look at the types of direct cost bases. There are several different types that we'll talk about, whether it be direct salaries and wages or total direct costs. There's then we start talking about simplified or multiple rate allocation method. And this is where we start getting into the nitty gritty. And that is what base is best for that organization to properly allocate those indirect costs across their entire program. So we'll get into those different allocation methods. And then, of course, there's several different types of indirect cost rates. And then, as we said before, there are some benefits and some drawbacks to each one of those type of rates. And the idea here is that we can recognize what type of rate best matches that organization and does what their objective is. So that'll be tomorrow. Then we move into day 3. And once again, we dive deeper and deeper into what the ICAP is looking like. So methodology is very, very important. And so we talk about how that methodology needs to be described within the indirect cost allocation plan. How are they pulling their numbers? How are they pooling their cost items? How are they applying the rate? We'll get into the application. What direct cost bases match that organization to better allocate, and so on and so forth. So we'll really get into the methodology on day 3. And then the application. One thing I want us to think about as we continue to go through this is when we talk about application, we're really talking about the financial management system. So if you think about an indirect cost rate where an organization is charging a rate, and that rate could change from year to year. And many times that rate will change during a crossover in fiscal years because the project might not be finished yet. So when we talk about the application, we're really talking about what capabilities that organization has to successfully and effectively apply that rate. So we'll get into that. ICAP documentation is a big part of this. We'll be bouncing out to an ICAP example that we've created for this class and kind of show you what a good ICAP should look like and the various components in there. And we'll go through those components in detail in that example, which you also have in your participant workbook. And then cognizant agency, we'll get into some cognizant agency and understand the approval process. FHWA policies for claiming indirect costs, they're basically the same policies that are outlined in 2 CFR 200, specifically Appendix 7 for state and local governments, but we will talk a little bit about that. And then finally, we get into day 4. And this is where we're going to take a lot of time to use what we call the ICAP review guide. This is a review guide that FHWA published, I believe, back in 2009. So it's a little bit aged, but it's very valuable. And it's a guide, basically kind of a checklist that you can use in reviewing indirect cost allocation plans. So it's a systematic approach that brings you from start to finish through an ICAP and points out the various things you should be looking for, the objective of that specific area, and some considerations that you should be keeping in mind as you look at that specific area of the ICAP. And then we'll actually review using that guide. We'll go ahead and take a look at the example that we have. And then we've got a small piece on ICAP negotiations. This is the final stage. You're presented an indirect cost proposal. And I'm saying indirect cost plan and indirect cost proposal, they're basically the same. When proposal is submitted for approval, the package itself is what we call a plan, because it does outline all the methodologies and the application and how it's actually going to be applied, what it's going to look like. So those two are used interchangeably: indirect cost allocation plan, indirect cost allocation proposal. And any other administrative stuff we'll do on day 4 in the course wrap up. So that's our 4 days in a quick summary there. So what should you know? The first one is when you're looking at an organization's ICAP, and still waiting for the slide, I apologize. There we go. What is the objective? So if you're developing an ICAP, your organization is going to have a specific objective in mind. That objective might be a statute that says, that is requiring that organization to claim indirect costs. If you're reviewing an ICAP, you need to understand what that objective is from that specific entity. A lot of times, and we're seeing it more and more, a lot of times that organization has to claim indirect costs in order to survive. I mean, times are tough out there economically for some organizations, local government agencies, MPOs, and so on and so forth. And so you really need to understand what is the objective of that organization. A lot of times those organizations, they don't need to claim all of their indirect costs. Maybe they just need to claim a portion of it. That is important information to understand going in. So as you're looking at an ICAP, understanding what their overall objective is very important. Is the ICAP in compliance with regulations? 2 CFR 200 are pretty much the main policy and regulations that go behind that. There are some others that we'll talk about throughout, but is the plan in the proper order? Does it have all those required components? Does it have the certification that's required by Appendix 7 in 2 CFR? Does it have an organizational chart? Does it have all the supporting documentation, meaning the numbers, the historical numbers? Does it have their indirect cost pools identified and segregated to where you can look at those? These ICAPs, they can't just be developed on the fly. It takes a considerable amount of time for an organization to develop an indirect cost plan. And it has to be, if we're talking federal dollars, it has to be developed under those federal regulations. So that we're gonna learn all of that stuff and be aware of what to look for. The next one that hopefully my slide will advance here in just a second is their financial system capable of charging an indirect cost rate through the projects or programs. And I mentioned this before, but this is extremely important. The application of the indirect cost rate has to mirror the methodology that they provided in their indirect cost plan. The numbers have to be monitored. In some cases, they may have to be adjusted based on, the first year or the second year, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The system has to be able to charge that rate across multiple fiscal years, because a lot of times, the majority of the times, these projects span across multiple fiscal years. There's different rates, and based on their financial system and what indirect cost base they're using, is it capable of charging that rate only using direct salaries and wages? Or is it capable of doing total direct cost or some sort of modification of that base? So there's a lot of things that have to be considered with regards to systems. And so these are some of the questions that you may ask up front. That's great. You want to start charging and claiming indirect costs. Is your financial management systems capable of doing so? And that's kind of where we're going with this bullet. Okay, so is the supporting documentation in order? This is important. We mentioned some of those things, but there are some required pieces that are in that supporting documentation. We need to find out and we need to confirm that they're all there, because it's actually a requirement. Next click, please. What direct cost base are they using? Once again, this goes directly to their capabilities in their financial system. So, and what is going to best allocate those costs across their program? So is it identified, and does it suit that specific organization? So we'll talk about those direct cost bases and what you should be looking at when you're looking at those. Next one, please. What type of indirect cost rate are they proposing? So there's 4 or 5 types of indirect cost rates, and we'll talk about each one of them. And once again, what best matches that organization? A lot of times, especially recently, where we're seeing more and more indirect cost proposals come across, not only from local public agencies to the state, but also our state's DOT across the country are starting to take a harder look at that. A lot of it had to do with the pandemic. With so many things shut down, a lot of state revenue was lost over that year. And so now they're looking at how to best recover by claiming their overhead. But when we talk about what type of indirect cost rate they're proposing, once again, we have to say, what was your objective? Is this rate good for you? Are you able to maintain that rate? Are you able to monitor that rate? And so on and so forth. And so it plays a big role of identifying what's best for that organization. Next slide, please. And of course, is the rate that's proposed accurate? And this is where we have to dig into the indirect cost pools, the direct cost pools, look at their numbers, tie some numbers out, look at their universe and see if they were able to, take away costs that are unallowable and what that looks like. So there's a lot of things to consider in that accuracy of that rate. Next slide, please. Okay, stewardship and oversight and subrecipient monitoring. So remember I said we're going to have to cover some foundational stuff, and this is kind of the start of that. This is very important because without understanding our responsibilities, whether you are a Caltrans employee reviewing indirect costs, or even if you're developing an indirect cost rate, you need to understand the responsibilities of the cognizant agency that's reviewing that ICAP. And if you're the state, then obviously you need to know what responsibilities you have with regards to oversight of the federal aid highway program, because those are the funds that are going to be picking up the tab on those indirect costs. So it's very important. Subrecipient monitoring, and we'll talk a little bit about that, just to kind of show you some references and once again, responsibilities and what does that monitoring, what does that monitoring look like? So we need to spend a little bit of time here because we are talking about so many regulations. We do want to spend a little bit of time of where those relations reside and what is that hierarchy. So at the very top there, you can see law. And when we talk about law, we're talking about United States Code. United States Code is basically the law that's passed by Congress, which directs the various departments, laws, on what to do. And it's all passed by Congress. So that's the highest law. So when you see up there 23 United States Code and the FAST Act, those are actually laws that are passed by Congress. Then you move down to the next one, and we're talking about the Code of Federal Regulations. And under that regulation, under the regulation umbrella, or that pyramid section right there, those are codified regulations. So once a law is passed by Congress, the specific organizations or agencies, I should say, that law impacts, for instance, the Federal Highway Administration or the Department of Transportation, they codify that law. And basically is what they do is they interpret that law from Congress and they put it in a prescribed law or a policy to describe the various procedures and the practice requirements of that specific agency. So for example, 2 CFR is the uniform guidance. It covers all federal agencies and all non-federal entities that are receiving federal funds. 23 CFR is the codified federal regulation for highways. So 23 USC was the law passed by Congress, and 23 CFR is the codified federal regulation that FHWA put into place to interpret and put together policies and procedures to implement that law. 49 CFR is up there because 49 is the transportation codified federal regulation. And then we move into policy, and we'll jump out to a website here in just a minute. But when we talk about policy, that's basically an internal agency statement of general applicability. It kind of sets the course of action and plan and the procedures on a statutory or regulatory or even a technical issue. And so it's a policy. Those top 3 are pretty much law. If you just put it in a simplified term, you have a law, you have a regulation, but those top 3 are considered musts. If an agency puts out a policy, you must do it. Obviously, laws and regulations fall in that as well. When we move down into guidance, that's basically an agency statement of general applicability and it's used to influence decisions and actions. It can be considered like best practices that have been collected. We have a funds management guide that some of you may be familiar with that FHWA produced, and that's merely guidance, but is what it is. It's what our intent is what we hope to see as the states administer the federal highway program. Those are the types of things in our guidance that we're hoping to see. And then you have information. Information is basically just like an interim document. It's used to issue some policy interpretations. It's usually seen in some sort of a memorandum, but it is just information. It's just a need to know. It's information that we provide to our recipients and sometimes, in some cases, subrecipients, to let them kind of know the direction that the agency's wanting to go with a specific topic. And then you have state law, policies, procedures, and directives. And those, obviously, a state law is a law, it has to be followed, and so on and so forth. There is a precedence, and that's why they have this hierarchy of law. State laws could supersede a federal law if that state law is more stringent than what the federal law provides. One example is like procurement. The procurement thresholds for the federal government, if I'm not mistaken, I believe is at 250,000 for a simplified acquisition, whereas a state's procurement threshold is usually quite a bit lower than that, maybe 100,000. In some cases, we've seen 50, and so on and so forth. So that's just a quick snapshot of something to keep in mind with regards to law. Sherry, can you click the law, bottom right, underline? Yeah, click that. And I sure wish I could get my PowerPoint back up. And then if you have a website that pops up.
I'm only sharing my PowerPoint, so you're gonna
Okay.
have to give me a
No
moment.
problem. Okay, so there's and I'll bounce out to it a couple of times, so no worries there. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Is what I was going to show you is there's a couple of websites out there. One of them is Cornell Law. It's got a lot of great resources. It has the Constitution up there. It has the various articles of the Constitution. It has all the various regulations, United States Code, and so on and so forth. It's a great resource. And there's several of them out there, but cornelllaw.com, I believe is what it is. But I'll get a chance and bounce back out there. Let's drill a little further down into more of the federal aid highway program with regards to regulation. And again, this is still, we're still kind of doing the backdrop here just to give you an understanding of these overarching guidelines, responsibilities, and requirements. So 23 United States Code 106 G4 specifically calls out the oversight program and state responsibilities for the federal aid highway program. And in that specific section, and so back to the legislative background, we kind of want to drill a little closer to our federal aid highway program. So 23 USC 106G talks about that oversight program. It establishes the program in general. It dictates what the Secretary of the Department of Transportation, all of their responsibilities. And then it outlines some minimum requirements. And Bob just opened it up right there. And Bob, if you can go down to 106G4 specifically is where we are talking about right now. And it outlines, there's the establishment of the federal aid highway program right there. And responsibility of the states is very important. It says in general, the states shall be responsible for determining that subrecipients of federal funds under this title have, and these are the two big things, adequate project delivery system for projects approved under this section and sufficient accounting controls to properly manage those federal funds. So this is why it's important to really understand that organization, the indirect cost allocation plan, and how they're applying it, because it's a responsibility that's outlined in federal law. And so we just wanted to point that out on there. FHWA, we still have a responsibility for general oversight of the entire federal aid highway program. So we'll do periodic reviews and ensure that the state is actually monitoring those subrecipients. And so that's kind of where we're at right there. And you can find that out in 23 USC. Continuing with 23 USC is the state responsibilities, and these are some key areas as well. And that is ensuring that federal funds are expended in accordance with applicable federal laws and regulations. This is a big one there because there's a ton of laws. When we get into the cost principles and you start looking at the various items of cost, it'll start painting a better picture of what we're talking about with regards to expending those federal funds in a proper manner. And then that second bullet there, it said, even though a state passes through money, because that's how our program works, the state gets the annual allocation, and then Caltrans determines what various local public agencies are getting what piece of that allocated federal dollars to do their programs and to administer those federal funds. And so that's kind of the trickle down effect, if you will, but the state still has ultimate responsibility of the LPA and the federal funds that they're doing. And then subrecipient monitoring, and I'll just fire off some examples here. They're in your participant workbook here, but states have to monitor the activities of the subrecipient, and they ensure the sub-award is used for authorized purposes. They got to review the financial and performance report. They've got to follow up on deficiencies identified in audits. I'm sure we're all aware of the single audit and what ramifications those reports have with a specific subrecipient. Very important. They're responsible for providing some training and technical assistance. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about reviewing ICAP and that connection that we have to make with that subrecipient. A lot of times it's not just a matter of taking their indirect cost allocation plan and trying to go through it without reaching out and talking to the individual that prepared it or the respective point of contact with regards to their data. There has to be some sort of a relationship and some communication back and forth. We'll talk a little bit about that.
And I just want to add, and everybody can write this down, but subrecipient monitoring and pass-through entity responsibilities are very specifically, and we should update this slide, they're very specifically outlined in 2 CFR 200.332. So 200.332 basically outlines and gives all the details for this subrecipient monitoring and what Caltrans's responsibilities are for monitoring the overall program and also in regards to indirect costs, which we're talking about specifically.
All right, so continue on, Bob. What Bob was saying is very important, subrecipient responsibilities. So we're on this next slide, definitions, 2 CFR 200.1. Again, we're showing you where to find all this stuff. 2 CFR 200.1 has most of all the definitions we'll be using. The next slide that we'll hit here in just a minute, we'll go into some of the other ones that you can find like in Appendix 7 and so on. But this definition was new for 2 CFR when it came out in December of 2014. And so it's important. Some of us might remember the old school of grantee or grantor or sub-grantee. All of that language has been removed from 2 CFR 200. Is what we have is, and I'll hit cognizant agency first, but since I'm already here, but you have recipient, that middle bullet. That's basically the DOT. Anybody that receives direct funds from a federal agency or a federal award, that would be considered a recipient. The subrecipients are your local public agencies, your towns, your cities, your metropolitan organizations where Caltrans passes dollars through. They're a subrecipient. So those two bottom ones are important. Pass-through entity is what Bob was talking about. Caltrans is a pass-through entity for multiple smaller organizations where they just pass federal dollars through. And as he had mentioned, the responsibilities still reside with Caltrans with regards to those being a pass-through entity. Cognizant agency for indirect costs, we tossed that one up there. 2 CFR does talk about two different cognizant agencies. One, a cognizant agency for audit purposes, which is the subpart F of the regulation, and also cognizant agency for indirect costs. And they can actually be two different agencies. You can have two different cognizant agencies, one for audit and one for indirect costs. So these are some definitions. You have them in your handout, but also you can find them in 2 CFR 200.1.
One thing I wanted to add to that, if you look at the bottom of here on subrecipient, and this is important for, say, Caltrans and the auditors, is an entity can be a recipient and a subrecipient. So while we'll just use, I don't know if anybody is from Sacramento on the call, but we'll say the city of Sacramento is a subrecipient of Caltrans dollars, DOT dollars. So they're passed through Caltrans to the city of Sacramento, but the city of Sacramento may also get direct awards from another federal awarding agency. So when we talk about a cognizant agency for indirect cost, it's very important to know who that is for the city of Sacramento, because if the city of Sacramento does have a cognizant agency for indirect costs, meaning they get direct federal awards, that entity would be responsible for reviewing indirect cost plans, and it would not be Caltrans. Caltrans would receive the agreement, the approved agreement from the local public agency. They would accept it, and then Federal Highway Administration, as a federal awarding agency, but not the cognizant agency for indirect cost, has to agree to allow whatever that other cognizant agency approved to be applied to the project. So it's very important that we understand these definitions and that we're defining our entities the correct way and ourselves the right way. So if you're a local government, yes, you may be a subrecipient of DOT dollars from Caltrans, but you're also very likely to be a recipient of other federal dollars. And so whoever provides you the most direct federal dollars is usually who would be your cognizant agency for indirect cost, and also your cognizant agency for audit. But like Eric mentioned, sometimes that could be different.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks for that, Bob.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a very busy slide. You have these in there in your participant workbook, but we're going to actually go through these because as we get into indirect cost allocation plans and proposals, all of these terms and definitions are extremely important. And you'll notice a couple of them can be found in Appendix 7. There's one down there at the bottom, centralized services, in Appendix 5, and then various other parts of 2 CFR 200. But that is your reference for all of these. But with regards to cost objective, and Bob, if you can click cost objective, it might fly through your presentation. And you guys, all of these descriptions, I believe, start on page 96 of your participant. If you go to page 96 of your participant guide, you can just kind of follow along. But when we talk about cost objective, it basically means a program, a function, an activity, an award. It could be a subdivision. It could be a contract. It's whatever that cost is being applied to serve the purpose of that objective is really what your cost objective is. It could be a major function. It could be a non-federal entity's functions. They could be indirect. They could be direct. So that's basically the definition of a cost objective. And so we just need to, when we say cost objective, it's the end part of where those dollars are going to meet that specific objective. And it can be a variety of things. Next one is indirect costs. And I think you might have to bounce back and forth. There you go. Yeah. Indirect costs. So indirect costs specifically are those costs incurred for a common or joint purpose benefiting more than one cost objective. So For instance, facilities and administration is the most that we see with regards to indirect costs. And that is the facility that Caltrans or a local public agency or an organization has at their buildings to support their entire program. That's exactly what it's doing. It's not supporting a specific project. It's not supporting a single cost objective. It's supporting a whole bunch of them. And so an indirect cost is one that can't be tied directly to a single cost objective. It is supporting multiple cost objectives. This could be, when we talk about administrative, financial people, financial personnel that are doing just normal financial type activities, whether it be reviewing invoices or doing payroll or so on, those individuals would be in your indirect cost pool because those salaries and wages are supporting the entire program because that's what that individual does. So the key thing here to remember is that indirect costs cannot be identified to a one single cost objective. And that's where you would identify it. And this is important to understand because this is one of the first steps that an organization has to do is to be able to separate direct cost and indirect cost. Next one, Bob. Direct costs are obviously the opposite. It's that cost that can be identified that benefits a specific cost objective. It's basically one cost objective, and some examples that we may be familiar with are asphalt, concrete, guardrail, anything that might go into a highway project, or even that project engineer that's out there working on that specific project, and he's recording his time onto that project. Now, there are some instances where you may have a cost item that supports maybe 2 or 3 cost objectives. And as long as you can identify, proportionally how much that activity supports each one of those, then you could actually include those as direct costs using that proportional distribution of that cost. We'll talk about that a little bit later once we get into the cost pools. Next one is the direct cost base. Direct cost base is that indirect cost base, or base is that is, it's the denominator in the fraction. So when you're talking about indirect cost rate and how we get that rate, it's basically your indirect cost divided by your direct cost base. And that base is the accumulated direct cost, usually total direct salaries and wages. That could be with or without fringe benefits, or total costs exclusive of any extraordinary or distorting expenditures. We'll talk about that. But let's say you have a giant project that you're only going to have one time. You typically are doing your road development and your road maintenance and so on and so forth, and your road construction. But then all of a sudden you run into a $500 million project, and it could distort that base. So when they talk about exclusive of any extraordinary or distorting expenditures, that's what it means. In that case, you might want to exclude that project from your base because it would distort your indirect cost rate. We'll get into that a little bit more. But the direct cost base, it should result in each award bearing its fair share of the indirect cost in a reasonable relationship to the benefits received of those costs. This is what we talk about when we talk about allocation. And, is that base going to allocate those indirect costs in an equitable fashion across our program? Okay, next slide, please. The base period. The base period is just basically the allocation of the indirect cost in a period for which the costs are incurred and accumulated for those activities performed in that period. Typically, it's a fiscal year of the organization. That's usually what we see. I don't think I've ever seen the base period be anything other than the organizational unit's fiscal year. Next one, please. The indirect cost rate. The indirect cost rate is basically just the device for determining fairly and expeditiously the proportion of non-direct expenses, indirect expenses that each project will bear. And it's the ratio between indirect cost and some other equitable direct cost base, which we just talked about. But the calculation for the indirect cost rate is your indirect cost pool divided by your indirect cost allocation base, or your direct cost allocation base, which could be total direct salaries and wages, or total direct total costs, or even a modified version. We'll get into those a little bit later when we talk about the various different types of rates and the bases. I'm going to pause after this slide for any questions, because I know we're moving really fast here. So next slide, Bob. Allowable costs. Allowable costs are the basic cost principles that are outlined in 2 CFR 200, specifically 200-403 is where it starts. And that in subpart E, the cost principles, it talks about the various things, and we'll spend a little bit of time on the cost principles starting today here shortly. But basically the cost principles outline what is allowable and what is unallowable with regards to federal dollars. Very important concept, very important to understand, because when you're looking at these indirect cost plans, you're going to dive into that those working papers, and you're going to maybe look at some of those cost descriptions. I'm going to pull one up here in just a second and kind of show you an example of some work papers that they've got their pools, they've got the description of those costs, and you can kind of run down those. And if you see something like lunch, or I think on this specific example it says food, that might be a questionable cost that they're including in their cost pools. So we'll get into that pretty heavily, but basically the allowable costs are those costs that are necessary, reasonable, and within the regulation to be charged to the federal award. That's really all we need to know right now. We'll spend plenty of time in the allowability area. Allocable costs. 2 CFR 200-405 talks about this. Allocation means the process of assigning or distributing a cost or a group of costs to one or more cost objectives in a reasonable proportion to the benefit provided to other equitable relationship. I know that's a mouthful, but basically, if a cost benefits two or more projects or activities in proportion, and it can be determined, this is what I was talking about earlier, if it can be determined without a whole bunch of effort, those costs could be allocated to those projects based on that proportional benefit. That's where I said, if you have 3 projects and you can determine that, this project is gaining 20% of the benefit of this cost, and the other 2 are, claiming 40% or something of that nature. If you can do that with a whole bunch of undue effort, and it's going to be consistent in your methodology, then you can do that. But the allocation, the allocable cost, basically we use that direct cost base to allocate all those indirect costs across the program. And we'll talk more about that. And then we have indirect cost allocation plan or proposal, interchangeably, basically, but that is all those documentations that identify, how that rate's going to be distributed, across the allowable direct and indirect cost to those cost objectives. And it also identifies the allocation methods used for distributing those cost objectives relative to those benefits received. And the indirect cost proposal is basically the indirect cost plan that's submitted to the cognizant agency for approval. And we'll be looking at a lot of those. I think we have one more: centralized services. I mentioned this a little bit before, but centralized services are those allowable costs of services provided by a unit on a central basis to its departments or agencies. A lot of times you'll see like motor pools. The state might have a whole bunch of state vehicles, and you might have to check those vehicles out. That's just one example. Also, facilities, if the DOT or Caltrans is in a state building provided by the state where they maybe occupy 2 or 3 floors of a 6-story building, then they're allocating those centralized services, those couple of floors to the Department of Transportation, and maybe allocating a couple of floors of that building to another agency. So those are just services provided by a higher organization in most instances. Okay, so in your participant workbook, and I want to scroll down, I want to say it might be page 111. Let me try that. Are you seeing my screen still, Sherry?
Yes.
Yes, looks good.
The PDF. Okay. Yeah, if we go to, this may have been where this thing fell up earlier. If we go to page 111 of your participant handbook, I just want to take a look. You should be seeing the ICAP example on the screen. Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, starting on 111 is our ICAP example. I'm only going to spend a few minutes in here just to kind of give you an idea of what an ICAP plan looks like. So up above that is a letter of transmittal, which we'll talk about later on day 4. But here's the contents. They have an executive summary, the introduction, the purpose of the ICAP, objective of the plan. That's very important. Indirect cost rate summary. We'll scroll through that in just a minute. Here's some of our requirements that are found in Appendix 7. Your certificate or your certification of indirect cost, your organizational chart. And then when we get into D, this ICAP methodology and application, this is where they narrate exactly, what their methodology for this ICAP is going to be. And then they start to break it down, and you see the methodology goes into the allocation basis, the cost pool classification, so on and so forth. Roman numeral number 2 there is centralized services programs and description. So they have that outlined in there. They have identified in Roman numeral 3 the direct programs and descriptions, other direct programs other than the federal aid highway program. Applying the rate, they have a section in there, and then they have centralized services and a few other things here. But the reason why I'm showing you this is because we're going to revert back to this quite a bit. Again, this is an example that Bob and I put together that pretty much has all the requirements. It was taken from an actual state DOT ICAP that we've reviewed recently, and it's got all the stuff in there. So just scrolling real fast, we won't spend a lot of time in here because we'll be coming back here very soon. But there's the objective of the plan right there. They've got some descriptions of this, that, and the other, what their indirect costs consist of. They include centralized services in there. Here's their summary, and this is kind of cool because they have their cognizant agency. Who's their cognizant agency they were submitting it to? There's the base period that this ICAP's going to cover. It's for a 2 fiscal year. They're using a predetermined rate. All of this is just on like the 3rd page. And it's telling us a lot of information right up front. Their allocation method's a simplified method, something we'll talk about here shortly. Your direct cost base, they've identified what that's going to be. And then on their summary page, they throw some numbers out there. And you can see that their actual indirect cost based on their supporting documentation is 152%, and they're proposing 150%. This is a lot of information in one page, and this is what they called their executive summary. Then as we go further down, here's some historical data. This is pulled from their financial systems, and you can see they have FY18 here, they've got 19, and they've got 20. So they have 3 years of historical data. And then you can see here in each one of these, they have their indirect costs and the dollar amount. And there's a workbook that goes with this that we haven't hit yet. And then they have base direct salaries and wages. That's what their base is going to be. And then over here, they have their indirect cost rate. And so the historical data goes on here. Here's your certification, which is a requirement in Appendix 7. and it's signed by the appropriate official from the state DOT. And then they have the organizational chart. This is kind of a unique organizational chart. They have their organization, which is very helpful because once you look in the supporting documentation, you're going to be seeing these departments. You're going to be seeing, oh, these expenses are coming from the Highway Division Administrative Report. And notice they've color coded them. Now, this is it doesn't have to be this way. This is just one that we really like because they took the extra effort and identified their various departments in their organization that are using indirect costs or direct costs. So that's that portion of it. Then we get into the methodology and the application. This is very important. And here, I'm not going to read through it, but here they're describing the methodology. They're describing how those cost pools are developed, what goes into those cost pools. Is there any exclusions? In this specific area, they're excluding the Department of Motor Vehicles. You can see that right here. And there's a reason why they are removing it from their calculations, and they're identifying it here, which is going to be important when we start looking at the supporting documentation. The central garage was also removed from their calculations, and their reasoning behind that is right there as well. Here's some more. They removed the load factor. Load factor is a fringe benefit rate. So they already have a fringe benefit rate, and so they're excluding that from this because that would be double dipping. Okay, and then we get into the cost pool classifications, and they talk about that. And then they get into a very in-depth procedural type thing where in their ICAP, they're actually telling us the methodology that they're doing within their finance system to create these cost pools and to identify allowables and unallowables and so on and so forth. So this narrative here in their methodology is very telling. Because it shows us the steps that they took, which means they're aware of identifying their indirect cost pools, their direct cost pools, unallowables, and so on. In this specific example, they even go as far as to identifying their financial system is the vision account codes. They go as far as identifying the actual account codes that we're going to see in that supporting documentation. So this is a very detailed and in-depth methodology of how they approach the ICAP, how they identified their cost pools, and how they did these queries within their system to extract historical data and to separate these costs and so on and so forth. And then they have some other various information. So I just wanted to open that up real quick and show you an example of that. The next one I open here in just a little while will be the actual supporting documentation, and I'll give you a quick navigational tour of what that workbook looks like in conjunction with this ICAP. So now we're to the meat of the whole course here, and that is the indirect cost allocation plan. We got through the kind of the foundational subrecipient monitoring regulations and law and so forth. So now let's see if my PowerPoint's happy again. Okay, so let's talk about the benefits of claiming indirect costs, and there are some downfalls that follow this. But when an organization wants to claim their indirect costs, the benefit is that it provides them some flexibility with state and local funds. Is what that means is that normally all of their overhead costs were being covered by the state, or if it's a local public agency, that agency has to cover their overhead. Well, once you start claiming indirect costs to the federal program, federal dollars are now picking up those overhead costs, which frees up state dollars to do other things. And there's some disadvantages to that, but we'll talk about that here in just a minute. Quicker obligation and reimbursement of federal funds. That's a benefit because if you have let's say you have 100% or 120% indirect cost rate, every salary and wages that go through your financial system, it's getting tagged with that indirect cost rate for reimbursement from the federal government. So you're going to go through your obligation dollars quicker because you've tagged on that indirect cost rate percentage. If it's 20%, 50%, 150%, whatever, that's being charged at every step of the way throughout the year. So you're going to have you're going to obligate your funds faster, and you're going to get reimbursed faster because you've added an entire new element to your program, that being your indirect costs. Another benefit, if your state requires it, and we run across this all the time, many states out there require all of their departments to claim maximum indirect cost. And we'll talk about the different rates that are out there. And it's a cash management tool, frees up those state dollars. Like I said, it can be used elsewhere. But keep in mind, it really doesn't give any extra money. So if your allocation in California, I believe you're in the, what is it, $3.5 billion allocation or something like that. I know it's very large. But at any rate, the idea here is that your indirect costs are going to consume some of that annual allocation of federal aid dollars. Okay, here's some disadvantage. So because you've freed up your state dollars, you may have a legislature that says, hey, federal government's picking up the Department of Transportation overhead. So, we can take that money off your plate and provide it to maybe the Department of Education or maybe the Department of Housing or some other place. So, it might be a benefit for the department to claim those, but it's going to be up to your state legislature and the powers to be over the state dollars to decide whether you as a department would, lose those funds in some fashion. And of course you probably would. So that's a downside of doing it. There is less dollars for construction. And this is what Bob was alluding to. This is a big decision that an organization has to make. If the federal funds are paying for your overhead and there is no extra money to do that, that money comes away from your highway program, whether it be new construction or road improvement, whatever the case may be. And that has to be taken into consideration at the highest levels of your organization with your transportation improvement plan, your state transportation improvement plan, whatever the case may be. All of this stuff has to be taken into consideration because those are dollars that are going to be taken away from your highway program. Administratively burdensome? Sure, it's going to add some time to the personnel that are responsible for developing and maintaining this indirect cost allocation plan. These plans, once they're developed, it gets a little easier. The first year that an organization develops one of these, it's a pretty heavy lift. There's a lot of information that need to be gathered. A lot of key personnel have to be pulled into that umbrella for developing the rate. A lot of data mining through your financial system. Just a lot of effort goes into developing one of these plans. And going from year to year, it gets a little bit easier because it comes more routine. But it does add a burden administratively to that organization. And a separate project for indirect costs cannot be established unless authorized by legislation. That's just a general statement. And there are a lot of agencies and especially local public agencies, they might say, well, it's just a lot easier if we just charge all of our indirect costs to a single project. Well, that's typically not authorized. FHWA does not allow that with state DOTs. There are some minor exceptions when we get into special rates or a narrative cost allocation type scenario. We'll talk about that when we get into there. But in general, the indirect cost allocation plan and the rate cannot be charged to a single project. It has to be charged across that direct cost base, with the exception of, like I said, a narrative, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So those are the disadvantages. So let's be real clear on the differences between the indirect costs. And we mentioned most of them before, and then we'll throw some examples up here again. But once again, those direct costs, they can be specifically identified to a final cost objective. In our case, under the Federal Aid Highway Program, that's a project. So, and again, you have direct labor, direct material supplies, fringe rate, equipment rate, so on and so forth. Are examples of that. But when you get into the indirect cost environment, it's a lot different. And that is where you have a, specific things that can't be tied to a direct project. Some examples might be like, I don't know, let's use a simple one, paper clips, okay? I mean, paperclip is a very elementary example, but it really paints the picture. And that is, if I'm sitting at my desk and working on a whole handful of projects, and if I wanted to put a paperclip on each package and identify that that paperclip went to that package, well, you could actually do that, but that seems a little ridiculous. So when you talk about office supplies, office support, copy machines, facilities, any administrative type work, those are considered supporting the program as a whole and not a specific cost objective. And that can go with the same with salaries and wages of your finance people and your administrative people. So I think we're pretty clear on that. Okay, so I think we've pretty much clarified direct and indirect, but let's take a look at some examples at any rate. So there's really not a universal rule for classifying certain costs as either direct or indirect, specifically with facilities administration under every accounting system. A cost may be direct with respect to some specific service or function, but it could be indirect with respect to the federal award or the final cost objective. So it's essential that each item of cost incurred for the same purpose be treated consistently. And we're going to talk about consistent treatment of cost when we get into the cost principles here real shortly. But here's some examples, and I had meant this to be kind of a question, but then I realized I gave you all the answers in your participant workbook. So let's just take a look. Here's some examples of direct costs. We mentioned some of them: direct labor, material, equipment, travel, contracts. As long as those can be pinned directly to a single project, then those would be considered your direct costs. Indirects, we've got your administration expenses, your facilities, depreciation, which a lot of times is done through an equipment rate. It could be part of your indirect cost allocation plan, but a lot of times it's in an equipment rate. Maintenance, same type of thing. It could be under your equipment there as well. Your human resources department. Another one that's not listed up there is your finance people that are doing various types of financial administration work for your entire program. Okay, enough on that. I think we've got that. Now I want to take just a minute. And oh, by the way, there may have been some previous slides, but this information on the very bottom right of these slides is where you can find the information. And we've tried to put that throughout the majority of these slides. Anytime we're talking about a specific topic or a description or anything of that nature or the requirement, we put the reference right there at the bottom. But let me pull up a workbook, and this is the supporting documentation that goes with the ICAP example that you have. Now, you don't have this file, and that's because it's about 160 megabytes. It's a ginormous file because it's all of their financial data that supports their ICAP that they submitted. And let me do a couple of things here to try to get it a little bigger. I will zoom, and you may have to zoom on your end. And we're not going to be looking so much at the data that's within here, is what I want to do is just show you the makeup of this workbook and how they've put it together to coincide with their ICAP. Something similar to this is what you would be developing if you're submitting an ICAP. And in the review process, something similar to this is what you would expect to find. Here, as I said before in our ICAP example, they took the time to, on a single tab called procedures right up front, they've taken the time to almost write their desktop procedure, not required, by the way, but their step-by-step task that they do in developing collecting all of this information to support the workbook. So they went an extra step and an extra mile because we had a conversation with them, which is a conversation you should also be having with any organization that you're reviewing an ICAP for, and that is a standard operating procedure from year to year, if that's the type of rate they have, to monitor and be able to pull this information to support the ICAP from year to year. So they took the extra time to do this. That's a discussion you should be having with your organization. Also, is their ability to maintain the ICAP once they start. So I'm going to rifle through these tabs just to give you familiarity from this workbook, because once again, we'll visit it a couple of times. So here's their indirect object class codes. They've actually identified them up here on top via color code. So over here, you have your object class code, which we talked about. Well, we didn't talk about object class, but we talked about cost objectives. But here's your utilities. They have all those identified, and they have a specific object class code they're using for those. The orange, I think that color is orange, is your facilities that they have identified up here. And then they have your office, which is your facilities and administration identified in gray. So this is a very high level, and they've identified these various costs in some sort of a table of contents idea, if you will, and you can you'll see this object detail code that they use in their system throughout this entire workbook. So this was pretty good. Their system is called Vision. Okay, so anytime you see Vision, they're talking about the system that they have. Here's a good one. Here's that org chart that they provided before, and then they have it broken down with their responsible units. So you can see this top one, the Maintenance and Operation Bureau. It's a direct charge, but anytime I see that code of 1,000 up there under their unit within their documentation, I know that's the Maintenance and Operation Bureau. And the org chart is in there to where you can quickly identify what direct, what departments are direct and which ones are indirect. So again, it's just helpful for the person reviewing and also very understandable for anybody else that has to maintain this. Then they jump over and they go into these Vision department IDs. And we're not going to dive into this, but they're drilling even further. Here is their department ID and the description of that specific department. And you can see these are all offices, service sites, policy and planning, various departments, and so on. So they took the time to do all this, and they're pulling this information from their financial system. Here's their Vision accounts, full descriptions of the various accounts that are used in their financial management system. Now, let me just make a point here. So I didn't just open this workbook when we were reviewing this ICAP and understand it from start to finish. I wanted to make a comment now that we're getting into this work documentation, and we'll visit it more, but I had to pick up the phone. This is that relationship that you're pretty much going to have to do with every organization. I had to pick up the phone and talk to the data people, talk to the people that were responsible, and they had to walk me through this. It took about an hour. And I said, I like your workbook. It looks great. Tell me what you're doing. Tell me so I can understand. And they did. They started from the left side. They started explaining it all the way through. And in about an hour, I could say, thank you very much. I'll take a deeper look. But I understood their methodology of putting this whole thing together, which was very helpful. I didn't try to sit here and figure it out on my own. I had them actually give me some time on this. And that's pretty much what we do with everybody. Here's some chart field additions. They had to add some things that were kind of outside their norm. This is the entire dataverse for the fiscal year. And this specific workbook, by the way, is only one fiscal year. So they have a workbook for 18 and 19. This one here is for 20. So once they got their queries ready to extract their data to provide for the package, they just did it for various fiscal years. But this has something like, I don't know, 370,000 lines of information or something. It's crazy. But again, we're not here to look at the data. I just wanted to show you what this whole thing looks like. And like I said, this is an entire data dump. And then from that, they started extracting out. Centralized garage, if you remember, I called that out and said they excluded central garage from their calculations. Well, here they have their data universe that I just showed you. Their next step was to extract the central garage. They did that. All costs from the central garage were excluded. I mentioned the fringe benefit. The organization already has a fringe benefit rate. So is what they did is on this next tab, they call that the load factor. They excluded all the fringe benefits because they're already claiming fringe benefits through a different rate. And they didn't want to include that into their ICAP. So they excluded it. I also, in their ICAP, they talked about excluding the Department of Motor Vehicles. This is their exclusion right here. They extracted all this from the data universe. If you arrow down, they have totals and so on. Remember, we've talked a little bit about allowability of costs. They've gone through and identified all of the costs in their universe that were unallowable costs for the federal aid program. So they extracted these out as well. And you can see over here in this column, they've identified those as unallowable. And if you look at the cost objective here, or the cost themselves, you can see there's food for human consumption, there's training supplies that they opted out of, here's some penalties that they didn't want to include, here's dues for membership. This will come into a better painted picture when we get into the cost principles. Here's some subscriptions that they excluded. Here's some catering, probably an organizational event, could have been a holiday party or something of that nature, but you can't charge that to the federal program. So you can see in here that they've excluded all those unallowable costs. They included a tab here with some other direct funding that they, are providing for other organizations, local public agencies, and also from receiving. Here's some other direct funds that they receive right here. They have some rail construction, miscellaneous information. You can see this, there's a whole bunch here, but I didn't expand the rows. But the point is they've recognized the other direct funding that they're getting outside of FHWA and also providing to other organizations. Now we start getting into the base, the direct cost base. They had payrolls and salaries as their direct cost base. And so you can see this is an extraction of that. Then we move over to the indirects. Now they've extracted all of their indirect costs that they're planning on claiming for their entire program. And that's a universe of indirect costs. And then it goes right straight to the summary. And here's the summary, the roll up of the entire workbook. You see your indirect costs for FY20. And in FY20, they had 151.53 would have been their indirect cost rate. And that's why they're proposing 150. Some of these other calculations over here are my own, trying to figure dollar amounts and so on. So you can ignore those. But that's all I wanted to show you. Let's get back to the main programming here. But We'll dive into this a little bit more, but that's just an example of the work papers that you would see in the cost pools and the work behind developing the supporting documentation. So let's talk about cost pools. So, the number of cost pools that you see in an organization can range from 1 to hundreds. In general, indirect costs, they fall into two broad categories. It's usually facility and administration. And you can find all that in 2 CFR 414, which talks about the actual definition of facilities and administration. But facilities is basically defined as the depreciation of buildings, equipment, capital improvement, interest on debt associated with certain buildings, any equipment, capital improvements, operations and maintenance of those buildings, and so on and so forth. Administration is that general administration and general expenses, such as like the director's office, your accounting personnel, your finance people, your administrative, your HR department, and so on and so forth. But not all indirect cost pools are the same from organization to organization. Let me give you an example. So you might have an organization that is heavy in manufacturing. They're developing an actual product. And so their indirect cost pools are going to look far different from, let's say, a service provider. A service provider, you're going to have contracts and you're going to have the services that are being provided. In a manufacturing organization, they're going to have machines, they're going to have tools, they're going to have replacement parts, and so on and so forth. That's all part of that manufacturing. And so your indirect cost groupings, this is why you have to kind of understand the organization. You have to get to know what they do, what is their product that they produce, what services do they provide. You have to have an understanding of what they're doing. That way you can recognize whether these cost pools are, kind of in line with what they do as an organization. So just be prepared for, different types of things from, one indirect cost plan to another. Okay, shifting gears here, let's move into the cost principles. So this is 2 CFR 200 subpart E, okay? And it's important because our entire program, the Federal Aid Highway Program, when we talk about costs and what's allowable and unallowable, they fall right in this wheelhouse right here, which is the cost principles. Remember that our program is federal dollars, which means they're paid by you and me through our tax dollars. And so we're limited on what those dollars can be spent on. And that's what these cost principles are all about. So let's take a look. Here's basically the breakdown of the cost principles, subpart E of the uniform guidance. They've got the general provisions, they've got basic considerations, and there's all your areas that you can find. And I'll actually open it up here in just a second. But your direct and indirect costs, you can find those, special considerations, and then selected items of cost, which Bob will take on tomorrow morning, which we get into specific items of cost and not so much the basic considerations. But let's take a minute here and I'll pull this up. And this was part of your read ahead with basically just getting familiar with, and that was the goal here of subpart E, just to know where it's at and what it's all about. So here, 2 CFR 200. And by the way, this is a great website as well, ecfr.gov. So ecfr.gov gives you the codified federal regulations. I mentioned 23 CFR, which is the highways. Here's 2 CFR, which is the uniform guidance. But we're not, this isn't a whole class on that, but here you can pull this up and it's the cost principles. And just as I mentioned, there's the general provisions, the basic considerations, but I do want to show you the opening piece of these cost principles because this is important. Remember, we talked about the responsibilities of a effective and efficient project delivery systems and effective and efficient financial management, basically. But 2 CFR 200, the cost principles opens up with this right here. And if you can't read it, I'll read it to you. The application of these cost principles is based on the fundamental premise, meaning that it's assumed before you even get to these cost principles that the non-federal entity is doing all of these things. And here's some of them. The non-federal entities responsible for the effective and efficient administration of the federal award. The non-federal entity assumes responsibility for administering the federal funds in a manner consistent with the underlying agreements. The non-federal entity, in recognition of its own unique combination of staff, facilities, experience, is responsible for employing whatever sound organization. So before you can even take these cost principles into consideration, all of these other things are pretty much understood that that organization is doing. The application of these cost principles should require no significant change in internal policies. However, the accounting practices of the non-federal entity must be consistent, okay? And it goes on and on. So the point I'm making here is before we even get into these basic considerations, which we're going to get into right now, understand that this organization that is either applying for an ICAP or getting federal dollars should already be doing all of those things before we even get to the cost principles. So it's a pretty big thing when you start wanting to claim federal dollars for one reason or another. So that's just a good read if you want to kind of take a peek at that. So let's go ahead and get started with the cost principles. It's important to keep this, the composition of costs in mind when we're talking about either federal aid projects or even costs themselves. When we talk about the total cost, meaning a federal award, when we say a federal award, we're talking about a project. The way the federal highway program is designed is that each project is basically kind of a grant all by itself. Sure, you get an annual allocation each year for federal dollars for your highway program as a whole, but each project is basically considered its own federal award within the overall program. And so when you talk about a total cost of a federal award, you're basically talking about the total cost of a project. So keep that in mind. But when you get to that total cost, it's basically the allowable direct costs, allowable is the key word in there, the allocable indirect cost, and those combined minus any credits or applicable reimbursements or discounts, things of that nature, minus those, that's what you come up for the total cost of that project. When we talk about credits, that's I think I mentioned this here on one of the next slides, but I'll just mention it right now. But it's basically like rebates. If you go buy instead of one police car, the dealer gives you a great deal because you're buying 5 police cars, that discount should be passed on to the federal government. We don't want to pay full price if you didn't pay full price. So that's what we talk about, applicable credits, minus any credits, things of that nature. But I'll talk about that here in just a minute. So keep this in mind. When we're talking a federal award, we're talking about a project, and this is the composition of costs that make up the total cost for that project. Okay, let's talk about these basic considerations. So the cost principles are all about the allowability of costs. There's several concepts that we have to respect to determine allowability. Who can give me an example of, and you can come on the mic if you want to, who can give me an example of maybe necessary? What would be necessary on a federal aid project? Or we could use the chat pod.
The salaries of the engineer working on the project?
Absolutely. If that engineer spends an entire week or whatever on that project, yes, his salaries and wages would be necessary. What else? I mentioned a couple of them earlier.
I suppose the actual construction cost is
Sure.
necessary.
Yeah. Materials, right? If you're going to build a road, you need, road base, you need asphalt. In areas, you might need concrete. If you need a guardrail, if you need iron, if you need steel, signage for that road, those are all necessary to make that road functionable or functioning for the general public. So you're absolutely right. All of those would be necessary. Reasonable. Now remember, all of these are basic considerations. These are questions you have to ask yourself when you're looking at a cost. So we already identified that certain cost items are definitely necessary. We know that. Now we get into reasonable. And now we're talking about the price of specific cost items. Who can give me, let me see, you can give me an example of what a reasonable cost is. And when I say that, I mean, like, is it market value? It's pretty much market value. Now obviously the way that we do business, we have contractors bid on our projects, a lot of them. Some of them are done by state forces, but with regards to a reasonable cost, what would be well, let me put it this way. So I'm building a bridge. I'm building a bridge across a river. And the goal of that bridge, for starters, is it needs to function as a bridge. It needs to be safe. It needs to do everything that it's supposed to do. But what about if I wanted to, I don't know, let's say I wanted to put some gold-plated signs on that bridge that says, I don't know, welcome to
The council member's name.
Yeah, or something. But what if I wanted to put something fancy on there, or like a gold plate on there? Is that a reasonable cost?
I would say no.
I would probably say no. The key to understanding reasonableness is asking if the ordinary person would have paid for that same thing. And so there's some gray area there. And so typically the federal government wants to be prudent with our money. And that's the prudent person theory. And that is, what would the ordinary person want to pay their tax dollars for? And gold plating that bridge is not one of them, I wouldn't think. Sure looks nice. And oh, by the way, you still see it everywhere you drive. You see fancy artwork and so on and so forth on concrete bridges and overpasses and things of that nature, beautiful landscaping. A lot of, there is some landscaping that's authorized, but a lot of that stuff is done with state dollars or local dollars to beautify the project. Those, a lot of those costs are excluded out of the federal dollars. Allocable, when we talk about allocable, it's based on that cost benefit relationship. So once again, when you're talking about concrete, steel girders, asphalt, those are easily identified. But when we get into the indirect cost world, does that expenditure benefit that project, or does it benefit multiple projects? And how much of our indirect costs benefit the federal program, and how much of those indirect costs benefit the state program? We'll talk a little bit more about, that here in just a little bit, in just a little while. They have to be legal. So to be legal, the cost has to be incurred in accordance with the federal, state, and local laws and regulations. So when we talk about legal, there's a whole bunch of things, obviously state and local laws, but the cost also has to be within the 23 CFR, which is the normal construction of a project. I know we've heard of, expend any dollars until you have authorization to proceed or until that project is actually authorized. That's one of those legal ramifications that you can't just start spending money without having that project authorized by the FHWA division. How about consistent treatment? We mentioned this one time before. Who wants to take a shot at costs and consistent treatment of those costs? Anybody? Okay, I'll give you a great example. So with consistent treatment, think about this. So I have a financial management staff of 5 people, and we work on the entire program. We process invoices, we do payroll, we do everything. It's all under the indirect cost pool. Well, I just been notified that we're going to be getting a big highway project coming through next year. It's one we've been working for. It's a major project. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, why don't I just, or why couldn't I hire a 6th person on my team as a financial management person? And since this project is going to be a 6-year project, why don't I just charge all of his salaries and wages directly to that project? Is that consistent treatment? No, it's not, because that individual is going to be doing the same thing that the rest of my financial management staff is doing for the program. So that's just a quick example of, the way you're doing business now with your costs, the way you're treating costs. You can't just, flip off a switch or flip on a switch and treat that cost differently, as you go along. Some of these I'm not going to go into in a whole lot. In accordance with the general accepted accounting principles, that's a given. Any of you finance people, and most of you, from what I saw, were auditors, so you totally understand that. Not duplicated. You can't have costs that are duplicated. Remember, I opened up that workbook and they had excluded fringe benefits, and they had excluded a couple of other things in there because why? They were already counting those costs in a different plan. So you can't have a cost that says, well, it's direct here, and we're also going to use it as indirect. You can't have the same cost in multiple pools. Net of any applicable credits, I explained that, discounts, rebates, so on. Uncle Sam, we want to take part in those. If you're not paying full price because you're getting a credit or a discount or something, we want that same and adequately documented. That's a big one. So these are the basic considerations for the allowability of cost. Notice at the top, allowable costs must meet the following criteria. It has to meet all of these, has to be necessary, has to be reasonable. If it's an indirect, it has to be allocable. Even if it's a direct cost, it has to be allocable directly to that that single project. Has to be legal and all the other stuff we just talked about. So this is
Eric.
Yeah.
We have a question from Margaret, I think. Margaret, do you have your hand raised?
Yes, I do. So the example that you just gave, it could be in fact that this person that you hire is going to be 100% doing the work for that particular project. That's going to be their assignment. So if you don't automatically just separate it out up front, is it then in the process of determining how you determining the proportion of time that folks are working on things, that's when you would actually get the benefit of having assigned that person 100% of their time to that particular project?
Yeah, great question. If you can actually identify and prove, meaning his timesheets, that's usually the source when we talk about salaries and wages. If you can prove that that individual is going to, let's say, spend 60% of his time on that single project, and the rest of the time he might be doing other programmatic type tasks within his job description that the rest of the team is doing, then in that specific case, you could actually charge that time to that single project. So yes, there's many situations that that are out there that but again, the proof is in the documentation. So he would actually have to be charging his time directly to that project, as you indicated that that's why they're hiring him, um, and that would be fine. Most of the time in the administration work and in the financial arena of the teams that we work on, usually you don't find that too often. Project engineers is usually where we find that, where they're being hired as an engineer, and for this year you're going to be working on this project until it's complete, and so on and so forth. And most of the time, anybody that's working on individual projects are recording their time on those individual projects, unless there's some special circumstances like a narrative cost allocation plan for local public agency coordinators there in Caltrans, some other things that we're aware of. But to answer your question, yes, it could be done, if that's actually the case, and you would just have to show that, that his time is being devoted to a specific project.
One example that I've heard that actually happens out there, that's kind of similar to this, is audit. Since we have auditors on the call, in some states, if an auditor is auditing, say, a consultant agreement for a project, that auditor will charge their time directly to that project. So that's a direct cost to the project. In other states, auditors are, the work they do and their salaries and all that kind of thing, instead of them having to track their time by project, they are, their salaries and wages are included in the indirect cost pool. So it's really up to the entity. And this goes right to what Eric's example was, and also to Margaret's question. It really goes to the entity to decide what's going to work best for you. And then, like Eric said, make sure you document and can show, how those allocations are made, how you're distributing those costs. If you're identifying somebody who's going to work 50% on a project and 50% on a whole bunch of other things, you just need to show that, that's the intent. And then at the end of the year, that's what should have happened. And if it doesn't happen that way, then we have to do adjustments. So, and we'll talk about all this in a lot more detail when we get into the actual cost principles tomorrow. And just also, Eric, just to give you a heads up, we're about 15 minutes
Okay.
from our end time. And then
Okay.
whatever we don't cover today, we'll definitely, make sure we've built time into this presentation over the next 4 days. So if we don't get through everything today, we'll make sure we're getting through everything by the end of the day on Friday.
Mm-hmm.
Back to you.
Great question, Margaret, as well. So here I opened up the cost principles right in the beginning, and we talked about the policy guide. And this is everything that was in there, talking about administrating federal funds. We've already talked about this, but I do want to pause for just a second. Notice that second bullet. It says complying with programmatic requirements and other terms of the federal award. That's kind of a new wrench in some of this. So when we talk about programmatic requirements, when we talk about 2 CFR 200, we're talking about uniform administrative requirements. Programmatic requirements are different. So in FHWA, we have 6 major types of funding, if you want. There's 6 major programs, congestion mitigation, safety program. We've got state block grant. So there's 6 major programs, and this is all for another class. But when you use a color of money, and that's the easiest way to explain this, when you use a color of money, that money has to match the programmatic requirements that those funds were meant for. So when we talk about programmatic requirements, if you're going to use safety dollars, then the things that you purchase with that money have to be part of the approved safety program under those programmatic requirements. So in a project contract in our financial management information system, FEMAS, each project is a contract all on its own. It's a grant all by itself. And whatever the description of that project, the improvement type or whatever, is going to decide what types of money can be used. That's what we're talking about, programmatic requirements. Administrative requirements, those are catch-all for all federal agencies, and it really doesn't have a whole lot, administrative requirements don't have a whole lot to do with, just like your facilities administration for your program and so on and so forth. It's the programmatic requirements that get into the details of the actual project itself, what type of project, what type of improvement, which determines what kind of money you can use. If the project has nothing to do with congestion mitigation or air quality, then you can't use any CMAQ funding on it. So that's what we talk about programmatic. You have administrative requirements, which are 2 CFR 200, and then you have programmatic requirements, which you'll find in 23 CFR and also under our highway legislation, like the FAST Act. That's where you find the programmatic requirements. So that's just, I wanted to point that out because it's a bullet that you may not have recognized. But when we talk programmatic and administrative requirements, they're two separate things, really. They're still requirements, they just kind of fall under a different umbrella. The rest of this stuff we already talked about: maintaining internal accounting policies, supporting cost charge with adequate supporting documentation, and not earning or keeping any profit from the overall project itself. So that's just the beginning of the cost principles that I had already pointed out to. The general provisions that they continue, and they've got A, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They talk about the principles must be used to determine allowability of work performed on a non-federal entity under the federal award. These also must be used by the non-federal entity as a guide in pricing and fixed price contracts and subcontracts where costs are used in determining the appropriate. So this is where we talk about reasonable amount, and they talk a little bit about there, and it goes on. You can find a little more information under this application for various different subrecipients. So in this section 200-401, you can find in there also for like institutions of higher education, like your colleges and stuff. It also goes on and talks about fixed amount awards. What does that mean? And, can we use that? Typically, federal highway administration or federal aid dollars for the highway program, we don't do fixed award amounts. We do the bid thing. Also has a section in that area. I believe it's Appendix 4. Appendix 9, I think, talks about hospitals. So with you guys reviewing ICAPs, you're probably getting ICAPs from institutions of higher learning. You might be getting, maybe you might be giving some research dollars here or there. So the cost principles talks about those specific cases, loans, scholarships, things like that. So here we are back to the reasonableness of a cost. Has to be ordinary and necessary. Let's talk about restraints and requirements. Basically, this just means sound business practices like arm's length bargaining laws, terms and conditions of the federal award. That's pretty much programmatic requirements there. When it says terms and conditions of the federal award, they're really talking about the programmatic requirements for that type of project. And we already talked about program. I'm just kind of looking at my notes here. Comparable prices. That's where I talked about, the market value. The good thing about our program is contractors have to bid, and you all are all aware that, we usually take the lowest bidder of, the contractor that has a good history and that can actually perform the job. Back to the programmatic. So our basic 6 that we have there for programmatic is we've got the National Highway Performance Program, the NHPP funds, the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. I think I called it the state, but it's the Surface Transportation, STBG, the Highway Safety Improvement, the Congestion Mitigation, and the National Highway Freight Program are our major programs there. So that's when we're talking about programmatic requirements, it has to fall within those 6 major funding categories that are under our program. Prudent acts, I already talked about it. What is the prudent person? What's a prudent person willing to pay for the improvement that you want to do? And establish practices. We don't want any significant deviations from the cost of the federal work. Like for instance, maybe lodging more than 50 miles away from the work. Certain things like that you have to consider when you're talking about the reasonableness of a cost. When you ask yourself, is this cost reasonable? You wouldn't pay somebody to go and stay in a hotel 20 miles from their house during the week that he's working on that job site. You wouldn't do it. Let's look at allocable. So there's a cost-benefit relation. We talked a little bit about this and the difference between direct and indirect costs, but basically, the cost must be related to the benefits received from the federal program. So, like I said, direct costs are pretty easy. If you can't define that direct relationship, that one-to-one cost-benefit relationship to the federal project, it probably needs to go in your indirect cost pool. Appropriate amount, we talked a little bit about that, just in the prudent acts. But when we talk about, which activities benefit the indirect costs, keep in mind that those unallowable activities and donated services and so on and so on and so forth have to be considered in those indirect cost pools. You can't just throw everything in either of these cost pools when we're talking about indirects or directs. You have to be very, prudent, reasonable, necessary for both indirect and direct cost type pools. Cost shifting is not allowed. That's basically where you say, okay, we're running out of money on project A, but we have project B that we just started. So let's charge some of these costs from, project A over to across project B. We don't really see that too often, but it's illegal. You can't do it. Cost allocation plan is required whenever any organization wants to charge those accumulated indirect costs to the federal award. You have to have a cost allocation plan. The only difference to this, and when I talk, it's still considered a proposal if somebody wanted to do a de minimis rate, and we'll talk about that when we get into the types of rates, but they wouldn't have to put together this giant plan that we are looking at in the next couple of days. It's a little bit different with the de minimis rate. It's also a little bit different with a narrative cost allocation plan as well. It's a little bit different, but we'll talk about those. But typically, if you want to charge indirects, any organization, they can't just arbitrarily start charging 10%. They have to get cognizant agency approval, whether it's de minimis, narrative, or any of the other types of rates that we talk about. So just keep that in mind. I already covered most of this, discounts and rebates. All of these are applicable credits, discovery of losses, corrections, overpayment errors. We can come back and request, overpayments or uneligible costs at any time. Okay, so let me see where I'm at. I think, let me end with just one more slide. I just want to do this one more. Prior approval. So the best thing to do, and you probably know with your spouses or friends or whatever, you don't want to ask forgiveness. You would rather ask permission. This is where that prior approval comes in. There's even a question about a specific cost on a project, the best thing you could do is ask for prior approval. That usually runs through the state DOT there, Caltrans, and then if it gets beyond that, it runs up to the FHWA division office, and they can give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down on a specific cost item that may be in question. And Bob will talk a little bit more about that tomorrow when we get into selective items of cost, but prior approval is very important to take a look at.